I heard this joke this week, and it might fall flat, so just bear with me, right? But there's an atheist, and he's talking to his friends, and he's just a little bit upset. And he says, I don't get it. All these people of faith have these holidays that they get to celebrate. Christians have Christmas and Easter, and Jews, they have Passover and Yom Kippur. And us atheists, we have no national holidays. And so the man thought about it for a second, and he said, have you ever considered celebrating April 1st? And that's where we're going to just stop. No, the idea of that really springs from the Psalms that we're reading tonight. And we can decide on how you want to do it. We're going to have half of the room open up to Psalm 53 and the other half open up to Psalm 14. Or you can, depending on where you're sitting, the person sitting next to you open up to Psalm 14 and the next person open up to Psalm 53. Because we're going to get through both these Psalms. How many people believe it? Angela, she's the only, well, now you guys all believe it. But here's what it says. I'm going to read from Psalm chapter 14, and you guys can read from whichever one you want, 53 or 14. So here's what it says. It says, the fool says in their heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. All have turned away. All have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Do all the evildoers know nothing? They devour my people as though eating bread. They never call out to the Lord, but there they are, overwhelmed with dread, for God is present in the company of the righteous. You evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, but the Lord is their refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. You guys catching on to why I might be able to preach on two Psalms in one night? They're the same, right? There's just a little unique difference. Let's read it from Psalm 53 just so you guys can see there's some differences. Psalm 53 says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and their ways are vile. There is no one who does good. God looks down from heaven on mankind to see if there is any who understand, any who seek God. Everyone is turned away. All have become corrupt. There's no one who does good, not even one. Do all these evildoers know nothing? They devour my people as though eating bread. They never call out to God. But there they are, overwhelmed with dread, where there was nothing to dread. God scattered the bones of those who attacked you. You put them to shame, for God despised them. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When God restores his people, let Jacob and Israel rejoice and be glad. And there you go. Same psalm. Right? Now you might wonder, okay, they're a little bit different. There is some differences, right? Verses 5 and 6 is a little different. But both Psalms are responding to a call for help for God. The other main difference, and the reason that these might have been that this Psalm might have popped up twice in the book of Psalms, is the use of the divine name, Lord, right? In Psalm 14, it uses the name Lord or Yahweh, where in Psalm 53, it doesn't, because in Jewish communities, after a certain amount of time, they began to stop using that divine name and inserted other types of names. And so the way this community must have done it is they took out the name Yahweh and put in Elohim, which is the more general, kind of generic name for God. And the Septuagint version of the Bible was the first to begin to translate that name as Lord and just leave the name out altogether. So that's the main difference between the two Psalms. One uses the name, the other one doesn't. And then there's some differences in verse 5 and 6. But in both, God is coming to the rescue of his people, right? He's there in the midst of his people. And so that's one reason I can get away with preaching both these Psalms. It shouldn't concern you too much that there are the same songs in the book, right? Because if you read the Gospels, you notice that they say the same things, just a little bit differently, right? And it had a lot to do with the communities that they were in. So same thing's going on here. But in Psalm chapter 14, what we have is a psalm that just is kind of pointing out that what you believe in God matters. What you believe about God matters, right? And it really does. That's why he says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They're corrupt in all they do. Their deeds are vile, because what you believe about God matters. Now, Paul will pick up this psalm, and he'll talk about it in Romans chapter 3, that there's no one righteous, not even one, right? And he'll pick that up all to make the point that in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, that the wages of sin is death. So his point is to show that there's no one righteous. But the context of the song and what it's trying to show us is that what you believe about God really matters, right? So, for instance, if somebody does believe in God, well, their actions are going to be changed by that belief, right? You believe God is in heaven looking down on earth, maybe as staring from a window, but he's looking down on earth and he has a standard for righteousness and what you do matters. And so if you believe in God, then that's going to be the foundation that you build your life on, right? You're going to begin to shape your life after the pattern that God gives you. Believing in God gives the individual purpose, morality, right? A sense of who they are, because it all stems from that belief in God. However, if you don't believe in God, now you have to come up with your own set of purpose, your own set of morality, your own sense of who you are. And all that will be subjective because the rock that you're building your house on is disbelief rather than belief, right? The fool says in his heart, there's no God. This psalm is so often quoted that who's never heard their mom or their grandma say, the fool says in their heart, there's no God, right? It's just such a common thing. In fact, we like to take it and put it on our Facebook posts or our social media posts because that's the quippy one-liner verse that we can take out of context and put up there for everybody to see. And so I started to dig into that and I found Mr. T, right? Did you guys see it earlier? I pity the fool, right? I pity the fool who says there's no God. And that's kind of where this verse has gone. It's a popular text. And we're going to see what is it about this text that makes it so popular and so relevant to us, just as it was relevant to Paul and relevant to David when he wrote it. And so we're going to get into the book. My first point is that the denial of God has a negative consequence in our world. The denial of God has a negative consequence in our world. And just notice, it starts out by saying, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and all their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good, right? The idea is here, where you start from is where your life's going to end up, right? A verse that's similar to this is in Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10, and it's the exact opposite. Here's what it says. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding, right? So just as wisdom and has a starting point, so does foolishness. What's the starting point? What do you believe about God? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Now, look, it's not to say that those people who reject the idea of God are unintelligent or uneducated, right? In fact, there are a lot of people who reject God that are very intelligent, very educated. The point that it's making is that if you start from a place of disbelief, where you're going to end up in life is going to look more foolish than wise, right? Especially from God's standard, from God's point of view, right? And there's that idea that starts there. And you can't, obviously, you can't say that it's out of ignorance that somebody doesn't believe in God, because Romans chapter 1 tells us very clearly, right, that creation itself testifies that there is a God, right? What could be known about God is being made clear to them because creation testifies that there is a God. So it's not the fact that they're ignorant of God. God has revealed himself. It's that people have chosen to start their life on the premise that there is no God. Now, in David's time, this would have been really difficult, right? There wouldn't have been a lot of atheists in David's world, right? But the statement can also be translated, the fool says in his heart that God is not here. Or maybe you've heard people say, God does not care. God isn't paying attention, right? No matter where that starting point is, if you start with the premise that God doesn't care about the events in your life, then before you know it, it's going to be corruption and vile deeds. Which is why I started off talking about substitute teachers, because I get to sub every once in a while, and it's usually the same thing. Like I walk into the classroom, and the kids have forgotten all about how the classroom is supposed to go. Right? They don't know any of the rules, apparently. They've been at it for 6 or 8 months or 6 months or however long they've been in school, but they still don't know where they go. They actually don't even say, they claim they don't have a seating order. Most of the time they do have a seating order, right? But they want to sit next to their friends, and so they say, well, I'm supposed to sit right here. they forget that the sub has, the plan for the classroom. They can see where they're supposed to sit. They also, things that are supposed to take them 10 minutes end up taking them 30 because they like to talk, right? They know that their teacher isn't there watching, so they don't really worry too much about it. And just about every like 4th grade and up class that I go to, they all say, my teacher lets me listen to music on YouTube, right? They're all saying the same exact thing. None of that is true. It's foolishness, right? Why? Because they don't think their teacher's watching. They don't think their teacher's going to know. And so because they don't believe their teacher's watching or is going to know, they begin to act in ways that I would only be able to describe as foolish. And that's what's going on in chapter 14 and chapter 53, is if you begin with the premise of disbelief, God doesn't care, the fool says in his heart there is no God, then the actions are going to follow that statement. And you're going to become more corrupt and more vile in your deeds. Now, God's assessment of things is pretty much the same. In verse 2, it says, the Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind. Isn't that like such a great thought? I like poetic language because God's not actually like looking down from heaven as somebody might look down from a window, right? That's the way that the poems or the Psalms make it seem, as if God is looking down on earth to see how things are going. And of course, the Bible is full of those kind of statements, like God looked at the earth and he realized that all the deeds of mankind was bent on evil. What did he do? He sent a flood. And then he comes back later and he looks in and he sees what mankind is capable of if they just all work together. And so he confuses their language in the Tower of Babel. He comes down to see what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. And we all know what happens to that. The point is that in Scripture, God is pictured as looking down or paying attention to what people are doing. But God is always present, right? He always knows what's going on. You can't fool him, can't trick him. And God is looking down from heaven, and we even know what he's looking for. The verse says he wants to see if there are any who understand. He wants to see if there are any who seek God. And by the way, the same thing. If you seek God, you begin to understand his ways and his will. And do you think as God looks down and to see if there's any who understand and any who seek him? And this is what it says in verse 3. All have turned away, all have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. When God is looking down from the window of heaven at humanity, he says it's corrupt, right? And in a very general sense, you have to agree with him, right? Paul uses this idea to show that all have sinned, right? Jews and Gentiles, both under the same decree. All have sinned and fall short to the glory of God. And he uses Psalm 14 and 53 to make that point. All have sinned. And so in a very general sense, yes, that's absolutely true. We all sin, right? In fact, maybe you feel like Isaiah, coming into the presence of God, and there he is, holy, high, and lifted up, and all the eyes on the seraphim and the wings that cover them. And Isaiah sees the Lord and he says, woe is me. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Now, certainly when I compare myself with the world, sometimes I feel pretty righteous. But whenever I stand in the presence of God, I am a person of unclean lips, and all of you have the same unclean lips. I live in a people of unclean lips. And maybe that's what God is seeing, that as he looks down from heaven in a general sense, all have sinned and fall short to the glory of God. And I have to say that's true about myself. But, we could take this too far as well, because verse 5 also says this. It says in verse 5, but there they are, overwhelmed with dread, for God is present in the company of the righteous. So even in its own psalm, it points out that there are some who are righteous, and those who are righteous, God is in their presence. So we like to take verses like this and make religious ideas and formulas and doctrinal decrees off of them. But remember, it's poetry. And although God's looking at humanity and says, man, it's a vile place, their deeds are evil, there's also those righteous on the earth, which God is in their presence. And so maybe you understand that. Of course, I feel like that sometimes when I go to the store, when I watch TV. It seems as if There is no one who understands, right? All have turned away and become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one, right? That's kind of how the world sees, it seems. Why does it seem that way? Because if you start out with a denial of God, then your actions are going to follow suit. In the same way, if you start out with an acceptance of God, that he cares about you, that he loves you, that he has a standard that you have to follow, if that's your starting point, if that's your foundation, the thing you build your house on, then your actions are going to follow that as well. I guess the encouragement in this first point is don't be foolish, right? Start off with a good foundation, a strong premise. There is a God, and he does care about you, and he does care about how you live, and he does have a standard of truth and a standard of righteousness, and it is your job to live according to that standard. He's the one who defines what people are, right? I heard a quote, and I'm going to try to get it right, but I don't quite remember it all. It says, when mankind forgets God, they also forget who they are. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. We start off with the premise that there is no God. We kind of forget our own identity and begin to make it up ourselves. But if you start out with the premise that there is a God, then he is the one who sets the standards. My second point, the Lord is a refuge from the foolishness of the world. And it starts out with this question in verse 4. It says, do all these evildoers know nothing? You can kind of hear like the amazement in God's voice as he asked that. Are you guys ever going to figure it out? Right? He's looking down at mankind. There's no one who does good. All have turned away and become corrupt. And he's just asking, do all these evildoers know nothing? I think God could see that as he's looking down from heaven, because when people reject God, their actions follow, because what you believe about God matters. Just think back to the Exodus story, right? They're there in Mount Sinai, and God had just given them the covenant, and they said, yes, we're going to do it. And then Moses goes back up the mountain, and there he is up the mountain. And after a few days, they begin to become discontent. We don't know what happened to this Moses fellow, they say, right? This God is nowhere around. Make us another one. And, Aaron, he just throws some gold in the fire and out pops a calf, a bull, right? There it is. And it says they worshiped and then they engaged in rivalry, right? Because when they changed their perception of who God is, their actions followed suit. And you see that same pattern throughout the Old Testament, where God is there and people are faithful. And then as people forget about God, they begin to act foolishly, right? And I just picture God up there looking down saying, do these evildoers will they never understand? Will they ever get it? Do you ever feel like God's thinking about that about you? Like I do all the time. Like, man, I messed up again. And God must just be wondering, like, are you ever going to figure it out, Michael? Like, you've been dealing with this same sin for years. Are you ever going to figure it out? But one thing I find that's comforting is when he says he's looking down from heaven to see if there's any who understand, any who seek God, he's not looking for perfection. He's looking for people who are seeking after him. And so I try to fit myself in that category, to be the one that seeks, the one that tries to understand. And God looks down and says, are these people ever going to figure it out? And the answer to that question is no. The rest of the verse says, they devour my people as if eating bread. They never call on the name of the Lord, right? I looked, and I've looked at several times, because the Old Testament is full of illustrations and figurative language, and cannibalism is one that it uses a lot. There's no cannibalism in Israel. There's no record of anybody actually eating people, but it's a way of describing oppression. It's a way of describing taking bread from one person's mouth and taking it for yourself, right? You're eating their resources, right? And that's what God says. They reject God, so their deeds are evil. How do you know their deeds are evil? Because they devour other people. They make life all about themselves, right? They devour people as though they're eating bread. Bread is pleasurable for right? Like, who likes bread? Some good bread, right? You take pleasure in oppression. And not only are you taking pleasure in the oppression of others, but you're also feeding off of them. But inside that foolish person, in their heart, Here's a look. Verse 5 says this, "But there they are, overwhelmed with dread, for God is present in the company of the righteous." And I think that's a fitting idea of what it is for somebody who's rejected God. If you look deep on the inside, the part that they don't want to show the rest of the world, they're overwhelmed with dread. Like maybe just the obvious reason why it would be, but why I would be afraid to be somebody that rejected God would be I could be wrong, right? And the consequences are severe for being wrong. And so at some point, rejecting God is going to lead to a life of dread, and there they are in dread. The other reason that I think they might be full of dread is because one thing that people who reject God cannot reject is how he moves in the life of his people. They can't look at people of faith and say there's not something powerful and profound about it. They might discount what it is, but they certainly will say there's something beautiful about it, something inspiring about it. And so when the reason in chapter 5 that they are overwhelmed with dread is because God is present in the company of the righteous. Those people that are living godly lives. God is present in the company of the righteous. Now, if you're reading Psalm 53, it does change that a little bit, right? And it talks about how the reason they're overwhelmed with dread is because, well, let me read it. This would actually be verse 4 in Psalm 53, I think. It says the same thing starting in verse 4. "Do all these evildoers know nothing? They devour my people as though they're eating bread. They never call on God, but there they are, overwhelmed with dread, where there was nothing to dread. God scattered the bones of those who attacked them. You put to shame, for God despised them." As opposed to like in Psalm 53, the reason they're full of dread is because God fights for his people. But you notice how in both Psalms, like this is the only difference between the Psalm is verse 5 and 6. The only difference in the entire Psalm besides the use of the divine name. But regardless if you're reading chapter 14 or chapter 53, the reason that the one who rejects God is full of dread is because they've oppressed God's people and God fights for his people. In Psalm 53, he scatters their bones. In Psalm 14, he is their refuge. But it's a beautiful thought that although the world at times, when you're looking down at it, seems to be completely corrupt, God is there in the midst of his people, among the righteous. And not righteous because we deserve it, right? Righteous because when he looks down, he sees those in Christ. Not just Michael, because if he saw just Michael, he would be someone who is corrupt. But he sees those in Christ, and in Christ I am a new creation. The old is gone, the new is come. I'm there in the company of the righteous. Turning back to Psalm 14, verse 6 says, "The evildoer frustrate the plans of the poor, but the Lord is their refuge." How much time? I got a few minutes. Okay. So here's the thing. Like this psalm is really pointing out that if you start with the basis of yourself first, that's a foolish thing to do, right? The fool says in his heart there is no God. And what you believe about God matters. Jesus tells a parable about this, right? Now, when Jesus tells a parable, what he's talking about is how like your life is made up of more than just the possessions that you have. But he tells a parable of a rich fool, which reminds us of the psalm, right? Because the psalm talks about foolishness. The rich fool has land, and the ground produces a great harvest, a great crop. Notice it's the land that produces the crop, not the owner of the field, because God is the one who causes things to grow. But the owner of the field, the rich fool, he looks at all that and he says, what am I going to do with all this stuff that I have? What should I do? So he knows what he's going to do. He's going to build bigger barns, and he's going to store things in those barns. And then he's going to take life easy, right? And just eat, drink, and be merry. Life is all about him. And that very night, God comes and calls him a fool. And he takes his life. And now who gets everything that the man stored up for himself? Certainly not the man, right? As I thought about that parable, it fits with this text because if you start with the premise of rejecting God, rejecting that he's there, saying that he doesn't care, saying that he can't see, whatever it is that you're saying, if you start with the premise of rejecting God, you have to begin to live just for yourself. And when you live just for yourself, you begin to oppress others. And the problem with that is God is there with those others that you're devouring as if you're eating bread. The psalm ends with hope. And that's my last point, is that God delivers his people through Christ. God delivers his people through Christ. And it's verse 7 in chapter 14, and it's verse 6 in chapter 53, depending on which one you're reading. And here's what it says. It says, "Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad." There's a hope in salvation. And where does that salvation come from? Zion. And David's hope that although the world seems corrupt and God is fighting a refuge for his people, David's hope is that one day God will restore his people from Zion. Zion is that mountain in Israel where Jerusalem sits. Zion is the place where the temple used to be. Zion is the place where Jesus was put on a cross and lifted up. And he said, "When I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself." Zion is the place where Peter stood up and proclaimed the very first gospel message. And the main idea, the big point of his message, Acts chapter 2, verse 36, "Therefore let all of Israel be assured of this, God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah." Salvation is coming from Zion. And it's preached first in Jerusalem, and then Judea, and then Samaria, and to the ends of the world, because Jesus is the fulfillment of David's hope that salvation will come from Zion and restore his people. And when salvation comes, you have what one response? Well, you got to respond to the message itself, but read the rest of Acts chapter 2. In Psalm 14, here's the response. It says, "When the Lord restores his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad." There's no better response than to give your life in praise and offering to God. To be glad, to celebrate, because salvation has come from Zion through Jesus Christ. The psalm is a good look at how what you believe about God matters. Just as fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, so the fool says in his heart there is no God. And depending on how you answer that question, is there a God? Does he care? Should I live my life according to his will? Is going to dictate the direction that your life is going to go. And so Jesus, I think, says it best. He says, yeah, you have an opportunity. You can build your house on the sand, or you can build your house on the rock. And the foolish person builds his house on sand, because as soon as trials in life come, there's nothing to hold that house together. But the one who builds their life on the rock can overcome all those trials, because the Lord is their refuge. Salvation comes from Zion. We're going to